Just like nesting dolls, we can nest our components. We can nest a component within another component, and nest that component within yet another component, and so on. And because each component is fully encapsulated, we expose specific inputs and outputs for communication between a nested component and its container, allowing them to pass data back and forth. There are two ways to use a component and display the component's template. We can use a component as a directive. Recall that a directive is custom syntax we use to power up our HTML. When using a component as a directive, we use the component selector as a custom HTML tag. We saw how to use a component as a directive when we displayed the app component template in the index.html file. The PM_root directive is defined as the app component selector. The template is then displayed within the directive tags. We use this same technique with nested components. Alternatively, we can use a component as a routing target, so it appears to the user that they've traveled to another view. The template is then displayed in a full page style view. We'll use this technique later in this course to route to our product list view. Our product list view is currently used as a directive, but that's only because we have not yet covered routing. In this course module, we'll focus on building a nested component. So what makes a component nestable? Technically speaking, any of our components could be nested if they have a selector defined in the component decorator. But does it really make sense to nest a large view, such as our product list? For our purposes, we'll define a component as nestable if its template only manages a fragment of a larger view, if it has a selector so it can be used as a directive, and optionally, if it communicates with its container. In this module, we'll build a nested component. Then we'll review how to use that nested component as a directive in a container component. We'll examine how to pass data to the nested component using a property with the input decorator, and how to pass data out of the nested component by raising an event defined with the output decorator. In our sample application, to improve the user experience, we want to replace the rating number displayed in the product list component with stars. In this module, we'll build this star component and nest it within the product list component. Let's get started. Here is a visual representation of a component that is nestable. Here is another component. It wants to use the nestable component in its template. We then refer to the outer component as the container or parent component, and we refer to the inner component as the nested or child component. In our sample application, we want to change the display of the 5-star rating from this to this. Displaying the rating number using a visual representation, such as stars, makes it quicker and easier for the user to interpret the meaning of the number. This is the nested component we'll build in this module. Let's jump right in and build our star component. When we last saw our sample application, we had completed the product list component. Now, of course, we want to change it. Instead of displaying a number for the rating here, we want to display stars. Instead of adding the code to the product list component to display the stars, we want to build it as a separate component. This keeps the template and logic for that feature encapsulated and makes it reusable. So let's begin by creating a star component. The star component can be used by any feature of the application, so it really doesn't belong in our products folder. We'll instead put it in a shared folder where we'll put all our shared components. If you are using the starter files, I've already created this folder and included the template and style sheet for our component here. Let's take a quick look at the style sheet. Notice that we have a style here that helps with cropping our stars. Now we are ready to build the star component. We begin by creating a new file. We'll name it star.component.ts. We then create this component just like we'd create any other component, starting with the class. Export, class, star component. What's next? Yep, We decorate the class with the component decorator. Recall that it is this component decorator that makes this class a component. As always, it shows us a syntax error here because we are missing, our import. Time to set the component decorator properties. For the selector, we'll set PM star. For the template URL, we provide the path to the HTML file provided with the starter files. We'll add the style URLs property, and in the array we'll set the first element to the path of the style sheet that was also provided. Since both files are in the same folder as the component, we can use relative pathing. Let's take a peek at the star component template. Here it displays 5 stars using the font Awesome star icon from the style sheets we imported earlier in this course. The div element sets the size for displaying the 5 stars to 75 pixels. The outer div element then crops the 75 pixels based on a defined crop width. This technique can then display partial stars, such as 4.5 of the 5 stars, by setting the crop width such that only 4.5 of the stars appear. Recall what this syntax is called? This is property binding. We are using it here to bind the title property to display the numeric rating value. For these bindings to work, we need 2 properties in the component class, the rating number and the crop width. Going back to the star component, we'll add the 2 properties. We want a rating property, which is a number, and defines the actual rating value. Since we don't yet have a way to get this value from the container, let's hard-code it to 4 for now so we'll see some stars. And we need the crop width. We'll default it to 75, which is the width of our 5 stars as defined in the template. This value is then recalculated based on the rating. Where do we put that calculation? Well, we'd want the crop width recalculated any time the container changes the rating number. So let's tap into the onChanges lifecycle hook as we discussed in the last module. We'll implement the onChanges interface, import onChanges, and write code for the ng onChanges method identified in the onChanges interface. In this method, we'll assign the crop width using the rating. The total size of the 5 stars is 75 pixels, so each star is approximately 75 divided by 5 pixels. We multiply that by the rating number to get the crop width. For example, if the rating is 4, 4 times 75 divided by 5 is 60 pixels. So we'd crop the 75 pixel display of stars to 60 pixels, effectively only showing 4 of the stars. Our component is complete, and we are ready to nest it in another component. Let's do that next. We are ready to nest our new component within another component. Here is a shortened form of the code for a container component and its template. And here is the nested component we just created. Instead of displaying the star rating number, we want to display the stars. So we nest the star component in the product list component using the star component's selector as a custom HTML tag. This identifies where in the container to place the nested component's template. With the custom HTML tag in place, we are now using the nested component as a directive. As we've seen in prior demos, when we use a component as a directive, we need to tell Angular how to find that directive. We do that by declaring the nested component in an Angular module. How do we know which Angular module? Well, we still only have one Angular module, app module. In our example, the product list components template wants to use the star component, so we add the declaration to the same Angular module that declares the product list component. We define the nested component in the declarations array of the ng module decorator, and as always, define what we need by adding an import statement. Let's jump right back to our demo. Our star component is now shown here on the right. We want to use our star component in the product list template that is here on the left. In the table data element, we want to replace the display of the star rating number with our star component. To do that, we simply replace the binding with our directive. Now our product list template will display our stars here. Next, we need to tell Angular where to find this directive. Since we only have one Angular module, we'll add the declaration for the nested component there. Add the star component to the declarations array passed into the ng module decorator. These are the same steps we followed earlier in this course to use a component as a directive. Nothing new here so far. Let's see what we did. We have stars, yes. But we see 5 of them. Let's clear out the filter. Yes, we see 5 every time. Hover over the stars and we see our hard-coded star rating is 4. It seems that our crop width is not being calculated. Let's look at the code again. We set the crop width property in the ngOnChanges method when the onChanges lifecycle event occurs. But the onChanges lifecycle event never occurs because onChanges only watches for changes to input properties. We don't have any input properties. So we have 2 problems. Our onChanges event doesn't fire, and we don't currently have a way to get the correct rating from the container. Let's see how input properties can solve both of these issues. When building an interactive application, the nested component often needs to communicate with its container. The nested component receives information from its container using input properties. For the star component to display the correct number of stars, the container must pass in the product's rating as an input to our star component. The nested component outputs information back to its container by emitting events. In our example, if the user clicks on the stars, we want to emit an event to notify the container. Let's focus on input properties first. If a nested component wants to receive input from its container, it must identify a property for that purpose using the aptly named input decorator. We use the input decorator to decorate any property in the nested components class. This works with any property type, including an object. In this example, we want the rating passed into the nested component, so we mark that property with the input decorator. The container template then passes data to the nested component using property binding. Recall how to use property binding? We enclose the nested component's property in square brackets and assign it to an expression enclosed in quotes. In this example, the product list template uses property binding to pass the product's star rating to the star component. The container component can only bind to a nested component property marked with the input decorator. So in this example, the product list template can bind to the rating, but not the crop width. Let's give this a try. Here are the star component and the product list template. The star component wants its container to pass in the rating. As we saw in the slides, we add the input decorator to any property we want passed in. It's a decorator, so we specify the @ sign. The input decorator is a function, so we add parentheses and add the associated import. We don't need to pass anything to this function, so that's it. And let's reset the default to 0. In our example, we decorated only one property of the nested component with the input decorator, but we are not limited to one. We can expose multiple input properties as needed. In the container's template, we bind the nested component's input property using property binding with square brackets. Then we set the binding to the value we want to pass in to the nested component. In this example, we want to pass the product's star rating. That's it. The product star rating is now bound to the rating input property of the nested component. Anytime the container data changes, the onChanges lifecycle event is generated, the crop width is recalculated, and the appropriate stars are displayed. Let's check it out in the browser. That looks better. But what if we want to send data back from our nested component to our container? Let's look at that next. Before we dive into passing events from a nested component to its container, let's take a moment and review how to handle events within a component. In this demo, we'll handle a click event on the stars. Here is the star component on the right and its template on the left. We want to do something every time the user clicks on the stars. Recall how to set up event binding? Let's add click event binding to the outer div element here in the template. We'll define event binding by specifying the event within parentheses. We bind it to a method in the component that we'll call onClick. Next, we write the onClick method in the component. The method has no return type, so we specify void. For now, let's log a message to the console every time the user clicks on the stars. Here, I'm using ES2015 backticks to specify a JavaScript template literal. A template literal allows us to use a placeholder to insert an expression within a string. In this expression, we display the product rating. Bring up the browser and open the developer tools. Then let's clear the default filter by so we have more products. Click on a product and we see the star rating logged to the console. Click another product and we see its star rating. Our nested component can now react when the user clicks on a rating. But what if we want to pass that event to the container component? We saw how the container passes data to the nested component by binding to a nested component property decorated with the input decorator. If the nested component wants to send data back out to its container, it can emit an event. The nested component must identify a property for that purpose using the aptly named output decorator. We can use the output decorator to decorate any property of the nested component's class. However, the property must be an event. The only way a nested component can pass data back to its container is by emitting an event. In Angular, an event is defined with an event emitter object, so here we create a new instance of an event emitter. Notice the syntax here. TypeScript supports generics. If you are not familiar with generics, this syntax allows us to identify a specific type that the object will work with. When creating an event emitter, the generic argument identifies the type of data that is passed with the event. If we want to pass a string value to the container in the event, we define string here. If we want to pass multiple values, we can specify an object here. In this example, we define a notify event with string data. When the user clicks on the stars, only the star component receives that click event. Instead of processing the click event itself, the star component can emit a new event to its container and optionally pass along some data. In this example, the onClick method emits the notify event and passes along a string message. In the container components template, we use event binding to bind to the star component's notify event, then call a method in the container component when that event occurs. We access the event data using $event. Since the event data is a string, this method takes in a string. Let's give this a try. What is our goal? When the user clicks on one of the star ratings, we want to display that rating in the product list component header. This feature may not be incredibly useful, but it demonstrates how to pass events from our nested child component to the parent container component. In the last clip, we added event binding to the nested component. When the user clicks on the stars, it logs a message. We instead want to send an event to the container component with that string message. We are back in the sample application looking at the star component, product list component, and product list template. Recall from the slides how the nested component sends data out to its container? It uses an event with the output decorator. Let's define a rating clicked event property in the nested component. Since this must be an event, we define the type of this property to be event emitter. Use the provided quick fix to add event emitter to the import statement. We want to pass a string to the container as part of this event, so we specify string as the generic argument. We then set the rating click property to a new instance of event emitter. This defines our new event. We use the @ to decorate the event property and then specify the output decorator so the container can respond to this event. The output decorator is a function, so we add parentheses. We again use the quick fix to add output to the import statement. In this example, we are decorating only one property of the nested component with the output decorator, but we aren't limited to one. We can expose multiple output properties as needed. Here in our star components onClick method, instead of logging this message, we want to emit our rating clicked event and pass the message to the container component. We use the event property and call its emit method, passing in the desired string. Now that we are emitting this rating click event to our container, how does the container listen for and respond to the event? It uses event binding. In the product list component template, we bind to the event emitted from the star component using event binding. For event binding, we use parentheses and specify the name of the event to listen for. We want to listen for the star component's rating clicked event. When the event occurs, we call a method in the product list component. Let's call it onRatingClicked. Recall that we are passing a string when raising this event, so let's pass that string into our onRatingClicked method. We do that using $event. $event passes along any data associated with the generated event. Next, we need to write the code for this method in the product list component class. Our template is expecting that we have a method called onRatingClicked and is passing a string message with the event. Our method returns no value, so we define the return type as void. Now that we have the message from the event, what do we want to do with it? Our goal was to display it on the page title, so we'll modify the page title to display product list and the message from the nested star component. Okay, yeah, that is not a very real-world example, but I wanted to keep this as straightforward as possible. Let's see how this works in the browser. Click on the star rating, and we see the page title change to display the message received from the nested component. Success! Let's finish up this module with some checklists we can use as we build nestable components. We just saw how the container passes data to the nested component by binding to a nested component property that is decorated with the input decorator, and how the nested component uses an event property decorated with the output decorator to raise events. We can think of the properties decorated with the input or output decorators as the public API of the nestable component. Everything else in the component is encapsulated and only accessible to the component's template and class. Decorate a nested component property with the input decorator anytime it needs input data from its container. Any type of component property can be decorated with the input decorator. Don't forget the prefix, and since the input decorator is a function, follow it with open and closing parentheses. Decorate a nested component property with the output decorator anytime it needs to emit events and optionally pass data to its container. Only properties of type event emitter should be marked with the output decorator. Use the event emitter's generic argument to specify the type of the event data, and use the new keyword to create a new event. Don't forget the prefix, and since the output decorator is a function, suffix it with open and closing parentheses. In the container components template, use the nested component as a directive. For the name of the directive, use the nested component's selector. Use property binding to pass data to the nested component. Use event binding to respond to events from the nested component, and use $event to access the event data passed from the nested component. To learn more about nested or child components, check out the Angular Component Communication course here in the Pluralsight library. In this module, we built the star component and nested it within the product list component. We can reuse this component in any other component of the application, such as the product detail component. Next up, let's check out how to build an Angular service so we won't need hard-coded product data in our component.